They said it was impossible, that a wild wolf could carry a child through fire and ruin. But at dawn, in the cold streets of Missoula, a boy no older than 8 appeared, barefoot, bruised, and barely breathing, draped over the back of a gray wolf, like hope refusing to die. No one knew where they came from. No one understood how the wolf had saved him. But this boy, he wasn't running from monsters. He was running from something far worse, people who called it salvation. This is the story of a guardian with fur like ash, eyes like sorrow, and a heart that remembered promises humans forgot. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The morning air in Missoula, Montana was thick with a damp, bone-deep chill. Early spring had arrived in name only. The sun hadn't yet broken through the slate-gray clouds, and the fog lay heavy over the streets, like a blanket stitched from forgotten winters. Missoula was quiet at that hour, only the sound of distant train horns and the occasional clatter of paper hitting a doorstep stirred the stillness. Gavin Rhodes was already halfway through his route. At 42, Gavin moved slower than he used to. His back still ached from the injury that had ended his career in wildland rescue 3 years ago, a collapsed spine from a fire line accident he never spoke about. He now delivered newspapers in the early hours, favoring the silence, the solitude. He had a weathered face, a halo of reddish curls under his wool cap, and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than anyone ever asked him about. That morning, he parked his aging station wagon near the remains of the hollow brick ceramic plant, a red brick skeleton abandoned since the 90s, now overtaken by moss and graffiti. As he reached into the passenger seat for a rolled paper, a shape emerged from the mist. Not a car, not a person, a wolf. Gavin froze. The breath caught in his throat. The creature moved steadily, deliberately through the broken fence of the factory grounds. Its fur was a mottled mix of ash gray and pale white shoulders, broad muscles shifting beneath its coat. But it wasn't the wolf that stopped Gavin cold. It was what lay draped across its back. A child. A boy. Limp like a marionette with its strings cut. The wolf came closer, paws patting softly over wet pavement. The boy was small, no more than 8 years old, barefoot clothes torn and caked in dirt. One arm hung lifelessly over the wolf's side. His face was streaked with grime. A dark bruise bloomed above his temple, and a thin scrape ran down one cheek. Gavin's coffee cup fell from his hand, shattering against the curb. "Oh my God," he whispered. The wolf stopped just shy of the sidewalk. Its amber eyes met Gavin's eyes, too intelligent, too sorrowful for any ordinary beast. The animal didn't growl, didn't flinch. It simply waited. Gavin stepped forward cautiously, both palms up. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt him." The wolf lowered itself slowly, allowing the boy to slide gently to the ground. Gavin knelt, heart pounding, and reached for the boy's wrist. A faint pulse. Shallow breaths. Alive. He pulled his phone from his jacket and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "It's a boy," he told the dispatcher. "He's hurt. I don't know from where he was just brought to me. By a wolf." Ash, though Gavin didn't yet know that was the wolf's name, sat beside the boy, never looking away from him. His ears were alert, his body tense, but he didn't move when Gavin gently lifted the boy's head to check his pupils. In less than 10 minutes, an ambulance arrived, its red lights painting the morning fog in violent pulses of color. Paramedics rushed forward, one of them, a blonde woman named Cora, immediately kneeling beside Gavin. She was in her early 40s, efficient and calm. "What's his name?" she asked. "I don't know," Gavin answered, stepping back. "He just came out of the fog." The wolf growled low as the EMTs lifted the child onto a stretcher, not aggressive, but warning. Cora turned, her expression softening. "It's okay, boy. We're helping him." She opened the rear doors of the ambulance. "You coming too?" To everyone's surprise, Ash jumped into the back without hesitation. At Missoula University Medical Center, chaos bloomed beneath the fluorescent lights. The boy was diagnosed with mild hypothermia, multiple bruises, and signs of prolonged dehydration. But what drew most attention was the small tattoo just behind his right ear, a crescent sun cradling a stylized eye. Too intricate to be random, too deliberate to dismiss, Ash remained beside the gurney as nurses moved around the room, his head resting on the boy's hip. Twice, staff tried to remove him. Both times, the wolf growled, deep, steady, protective. The growls weren't threats. They were promises. Dr. Valerie Quinn entered the trauma room just after 7:30 a.m. She was 38, with chestnut hair, pinned back, olive-toned skin, and an aura of quiet gravity. A trauma specialist with years of fieldwork, Valerie had a reputation for working well in chaos, though her own life was anything but steady. She had returned to Missoula after the death of her mother to take care of the old family home, and the memory she wasn't ready to face. When Valerie saw the wolf curled up beside the unconscious boy, she didn't shout or command it to leave. Instead, she knelt. "You're not going to hurt him, are you?" she murmured. Ash lifted his head, met her eyes, then lowered it again. Valerie examined the boy carefully, noting the bruising patterns, the lack of defensive wounds. This wasn't a street accident. This was something darker. When she reached to feel his neck pulse, her fingers brushed over the tattoo. Her brow furrowed. Later, when the boy was moved to a private room in the pediatric ICU, Ash padded silently beside the stretcher. Nurses began whispering stories of animals who refused to leave loved ones of guardian spirits in fur and fang. Valerie, ever the skeptic, said little, but she noticed something odd about the wolf's collar. It wasn't standard. Woven military-grade nylon, reinforced seams, a tag etched with numbers and symbols she couldn't quite read. She made a mental note to look closer. Back in the ER bay, Gavin stood near the vending machines giving his statement to a police officer. "I know how it sounds," he said, "but I saw it. That wolf carried him out of the fog, like he was sent." Valerie returned to check vitals later that evening. The boy hadn't stirred. No name, no sound, only the shallow rise and fall of his chest. But when Ash shifted, the boy's fingers twitched, faintly curling into the wolf's fur. That was enough for Valerie. She placed a fresh blanket on the end of the bed and a bowl of water beside Ash. "You can stay," she whispered. "You've earned it." Outside the window, Missoula remained shrouded in clouds. But inside that hospital room, where a wolf guarded a broken child, something was changing. Something that felt like the start of a story not yet told. The mist that had clung to Missoula's streets had begun to lift by the following afternoon, but the weight of unanswered questions remained as heavy as ever inside Missoula University Medical Center. Outside, the clouds broke in slow layers, revealing streaks of pale gold sunlight over the Bitterroot Mountains. Inside, the air was sterile, humming faintly with the sound of ventilators and intercoms. But in room 214, everything was still. Wyatt had not moved. His breaths remained shallow, steady, and his small hand still rested lightly against the gray fur of the wolf that refused to leave his side. Dr. Valerie Quinn stood at the window, her lab coat draped over one arm, her eyes scanning the city skyline that shimmered like glass beyond the hospital walls. She wasn't the kind of doctor who flinched at silence, but there was something about this child, this wolf, that felt outside the usual lines of medicine and reason. She took a slow breath, then walked back to the bedside, kneeling quietly to examine the collar worn by the wolf. It was a thick, weatherproof nylon band, reinforced with heavy-duty stitching. Her fingers ran across a metal tag nearly rubbed smooth by time. As she lifted the band gently, she caught sight of something tucked beneath the inner seam, a chip no larger than a grain of rice. Etched into the tag was a symbol she hadn't seen in years. A sunflower split down the middle, its petals jagged and uneven. Her heart thudded once hard. Her father had drawn that exact emblem once late at night in his basement study. Colonel Stephen Quinn, a man who spoke more in diagrams than in words, had once worked with a covert military K-9 unit known as Sierra Echo. She'd thought the files were only theory pages of abstract concepts about animal cognition, emotional tracking, field bonding. The program had supposedly been disbanded. Now, a real wolf lay in front of her, wearing that symbol. She stood quickly, collar in hand. Before leaving the hospital, Valerie made a call. Not to law enforcement, not yet. Instead, she dialed someone she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Micah Chen was a cybersecurity specialist, 39, with a love for caffeine conspiracy podcasts and old jazz records. He worked from a cluttered electronics repair shop downtown, a place where LED lights danced behind tinted windows, and the smell of solder clung to the walls. Valerie drove straight there, her heart skipping each time she looked at the collar beside her on the passenger seat. Micah opened the door, still wearing his oversized hoodie, his hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of a server cabinet. He had a goatee trimmed with uneven precision and wireframe glasses he never seemed to clean. Well, he said, taking the collar from her, "This is different from the usual laptop virus. Can you scan it?" Valerie asked. He was already walking back to his desk. "Plug it in and decrypt, sure. But you owe me lunch, and no tofu this time." Back at the hospital, Wyatt stirred slightly. His eyes fluttered, but didn't open. A nurse, Devin Lott, a soft-spoken man in his early 30s, with sandy brown hair and a habit of talking to patients even when they couldn't respond, adjusted his IV and gently checked his vitals. "You're doing good, kid," he said quietly. "You've got half the hospital rooting for you, and one very loyal wolf." Ash didn't move, only flicked his tail once in acknowledgement. Valerie returned an hour later, her boots damp from melting snow. She didn't come alone. With her was Jody Lamar, a social worker from Gallatin Ridge Children's Home, which operated out of a repurposed convent near Flathead Lake. Jody was in her mid-50s, short with steel gray hair in a loose bun, and wore a cardigan dusted with lint and dog hair. She'd been in child services for 2 decades and had a nose for lies and systems that broke kids instead of saving them. Valerie briefed her on the situation in the hallway. "No name." Jody asked, her tone more curious than concerned. "None that we can find," Valerie replied. "No records, not even a hit on facial recognition. It's like he doesn't exist." Jody raised an eyebrow, or someone made him disappear. Inside the room, Jody approached with the kind of calm presence that came from years of trauma work. She knelt beside Wyatt's bed, her voice gentle. "My name's Jody. You don't have to say anything. I'm just here to help." She placed a coloring book on the table and a small stuffed rabbit beside his pillow. "We'll go slow, okay?" Wyatt didn't stir. But when Jody stood, she noticed his fingers clutching Ash's fur a little tighter. Later that evening, Valerie returned to Micah's shop. He looked up from his dual-screen setup, where lines of code danced like falling rain. "It's not just a tracker," he said. "This chip holds encrypted logs, time-stamped entries, biometric data movement reports, and a file named Echo 7. He turned one screen toward her. "This wolf's not just bonded. He was part of something bigger, something built." Valerie stared at the screen, her voice barely audible. "Sierra Echo." Micah nodded. "Still classified. But this tag matches your dad's old files, doesn't it?" Valerie felt a chill pass through her despite the warmth of the room. "It does." Micah leaned back. "There's more. The last GPS tag logged from this collar places it less than a mile from a decommissioned storage facility outside the city. Records show it belonged to a private research group that folded a few years ago. Name wasn't familiar until I traced its parent company, Dawnlight Holdings." Valerie's breath caught. "I've heard of them. she whispered. My father warned me about that name once. Micah handed her a flash drive. It's all here. But be careful, Val. This isn't just science anymore. Someone wanted this buried. She left the shop with her fingers clenched around the flash drive and the weight of old secrets pressing on her lungs. Back at the hospital, Ash had not moved from his place beside Wyatt. Night had fallen over Missoula, and soft snow had begun to drift over the city, like quiet ash from an unseen fire. The wolf's ears twitched as Valerie stepped into the room. She placed the collar back gently beside him and whispered, I don't know what they made you do, but you didn't forget him. That means something. Wyatt's eyes remained closed, but a single tear traced the curve of his cheek. The next morning brought a trembling stillness to Missoula. The snow that had begun the night before had stopped, but its remnants coated the city in a sheen of frost that caught the early light like shattered glass. In the quiet corner room of the hospital, Wyatt finally opened his eyes. Valerie had been asleep in the chair when it happened, her notebook half open on her lap. Ash, ever alert, gave a low, gentle huff that roused her before he moved. She blinked groggily, then focused on the boy. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, but conscious. Wyatt, she said softly. Do you know where you are? He didn't answer, but his gaze drifted to Ash, then slowly to Valerie. There was no fear, just exhaustion, and something else. Recognition. She didn't press. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and held out a simple item, a pencil and a pad of paper. Can you draw something for me? She asked gently. It took several minutes before Wyatt moved. With trembling fingers, he took the pencil and began sketching. He drew slowly, deliberately lines that curved and split and rejoined. When he finished, he passed the paper to Valerie and curled back against Ash, who tucked his body close around him. The drawing was crude, but unmistakable. A sunflower split down the center petals, frayed like torn fabric. Beneath it, in childlike block letters, was a word, Hazel. Valerie's breath caught. She leaned back in the chair, the air thick with unsaid things. Wyatt had a sister, and she might still be alive. She stepped into the hallway and found Gavin waiting near the vending machines, sipping bitter coffee from a foam cup. He's awake, she told him. Gavin straightened. Does he remember? Valerie handed him the sketch. He squinted at the name, his jaw tightening. Hazel, he murmured. You think it's real? I think it's a place to start. By midday, Jody Lamar arrived from Gallatin Ridge. She wore the same cardigan this time, with a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. I've seen symbols like that before, she said, after seeing the drawing. Years ago, when I was handling a case near Thompson Falls. There were reports of a group that operated under a religious front. Called themselves the Order of the Dawnlight. Valerie glanced at Gavin, who said nothing. They were investigated and disappeared before charges could stick. Jody continued. Rumors said they worked with children, rebranding, renaming. Some kind of spiritual rebirth. Most of it was scrubbed. Valerie nodded slowly. My father documented similar cases when he was still in the Army. I didn't believe it back then. Jody exhaled. Sometimes belief comes too late. That afternoon, Wyatt was discharged into temporary foster care under Jody's supervision. Valerie insisted on riding with them to Gallatin Ridge. Gavin offered to follow in his car with Ash, who refused to leave Wyatt's side, now officially registered as an emotional support animal. The drive took just under an hour. Gallatin Ridge was nestled along the edge of a wooded reserve, housed in what had once been a Catholic convent. Ivy climbed the walls. Wind chimes danced in the breeze above flower beds frozen in winter's grip. The children's center had a warmth to it. Polished floors, paper stars hanging from ceilings, quiet music playing in the background. Wyatt was shown to a private room. Valerie stayed behind in the common area with Jody, who retrieved a folder from the intake desk. There was one more thing, she said, flipping it open. We had him try a set of visual prompts earlier. He didn't respond to most, but this one, she slid a drawing across the table. It was similar to the first, But this time, beside the broken sunflower, Wyatt had drawn a staircase leading underground. At the end of the steps was a heavy door cracked open. Valerie stared. He remembers a bunker. Ash, lying on the rug nearby, lifted his head. Valerie stood slowly. Let's find it. The next morning, Valerie, Gavin, Wyatt, and Ash headed toward the western edge of Missoula, where the forest thickened and old infrastructure gave way to wild growth. Wyatt, bundled in a navy coat with his hands tucked into Ash's fur, said nothing the entire drive. But when they passed a bridge half-collapsed, overgrown with moss and bent railings, he tapped the window. There, he said hoarsely, his first spoken word since awakening. They stopped and stepped out. The air was sharper here, the wind moving through the trees like whispers in a dead language. Ash padded ahead, nose low, tail stiff with purpose. Wyatt pointed toward the underside of the bridge, where ivy concealed something metallic. A door. It was set into the concrete slope, half buried with rust along its edges, and a bolt long seized with time. Gavin moved first, pulling at the handle. It groaned but didn't budge. He retrieved a crowbar from the trunk and returned, muscles flexing as he worked the rust loose. Finally, the door yawned open. Inside was a stairwell descending into darkness, the walls marked with peeling paint and damp stains. Valerie clicked on a flashlight and led the way, Ash following close behind. At the bottom was a corridor lined with old lockers and decaying wood benches. Papers littered the floor. One still clung to a corkboard, new identifications pending approval. They found the records room at the far end, metal drawers most rusted shut, some barely hanging on their hinges. Valerie pried one open and began searching. Her hands trembled as she read. Documents labeled subject names, birth years, and status changes. Most bore scribbles, redactions, assigned names. She froze when she found a half-burned file. Name Wyatt E. assigned Micah D., next of kin Hazel E. She turned the next page and found a photograph. Wyatt younger, his eyes less hollow. And beside him, a girl with matching features. Hazel. I knew it, Valerie whispered. Gavin looked over her shoulder, then turned to Wyatt, who had stepped quietly into the room. The boy reached for the photo, touching it with the tips of his fingers. She's still there, he said softly. But not here. Valerie looked at him. Where? He pointed downward, below, farther in. The air inside the lower levels of the bunker was dense and stale, thick with the scent of mold old paper and something metallic like rust and dried blood. Their footsteps echoed faintly, swallowed by the stone and silence. Valerie led the way, flashlight beam slicing through the dark like a narrow window. Behind her, Gavin kept close to Wyatt, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder as they navigated the narrow corridor. Ash moved ahead in near silence, tail low ears, forward the perfect sentinel. They came to a heavy door marked Archives, Level B. The metal was warped from heat, and soot streaks marred the frame. Valerie hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, the room had been scorched, burned, but not destroyed. Charred remnants of furniture clung to the floor like skeletons. Near the back, crouched behind an overturned table, was a girl. She looked no older than 12. Her skin was pale, streaked with ash. Her hair was dark and tangled into long cords, and her clothes hung from her frame like they had once belonged to someone larger. When she heard the door, she bolted, upright eyes wide and wild. She backed into the wall, arms raised. Ash stepped forward before Valerie could say anything. The wolf's gait was slow, deliberate, familiar. The girl's body sagged. Her eyes filled with something between relief and disbelief. "You!" she breathed. "You came back." Valerie lowered her flashlight and knelt. "It's okay," she said gently. "We're not here to hurt you." The girl took a step forward, lips trembling. "That's Ash. He saved us. He pulled us out when the smoke came. I thought he burned." Valerie stood slowly. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "They called me Luna, but I don't think it's my real name." Wyatt stepped from behind Gavin. His voice was hoarse. "You knew Hazel." Luna's head snapped toward him, her breath hitched. You're her brother." Gavin put a hand on Valerie's arm. "How many kids were down here?" "Dozens," Luna said. "Most are gone now. Taken. Some ran during the fire. I stayed because I thought Hazel might come back." Valerie reached into her coat and showed the girl the photograph they'd found. Luna stared at it, tears welling in her soot-dark eyes. "She's alive," she whispered. "They took her to Hollow Pines." Valerie stiffened. "Where?" "A place in the Bitterroot Mountains. They called it a sanctuary, but it was worse. They wore robes, spoke in riddles, said we were chosen. Hazel fought back. They sedated her, said she needed cleansing. Then they moved her." Valerie exchanged a glance with Gavin. He spoke first. "We need to get her out. Tonight." They led Luna back through the tunnels. The cold outside felt purer after the stifling weight of the underground. Valerie made the call to Jody, who agreed to take Luna into protective care at Gallatin Ridge. But the quiet didn't last. That afternoon, as Valerie and Gavin returned to the center with Wyatt and Ash, they found the parking lot occupied by a long black car and 2 uniformed men standing near the steps. A man stood between them, tall, lean, in his early 60s. His black coat was perfectly tailored, a silver clerical collar gleaming at his throat. His hair was slicked back white as snow, and his eyes held a dangerous calm. "Pastor Elias Voss." He extended a gloved hand toward Valerie. "Dr. Quinn, I presume? I've come for the child." Valerie didn't take his hand. "I don't believe we've met." "I represent the Order of the Dawnlight," he said, voice smooth. "We have lawful custody over Wyatt Ellison, formerly known as Micah D., as documented in these papers." He handed over a folded court order. Valerie scanned it, her jaw tightening. Jody emerged from the center. "That's a private order," she said. "Not vetted. You have no legal ground to remove him." Voss tilted his head. "Our mission is spiritual care. He belongs with his kin." At that moment, the center's main door opened again. Sheriff Nolan Beck stepped out, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with a lined face and a voice that rarely rose above a calm warning. A former Army Ranger turned small-town lawman, Nolan had seen enough manipulation in his years to recognize a predator in polished shoes. "I've reviewed your documents," he said, "and I'm not handing over a child to any group I haven't investigated personally." Voss's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sheriff, this is obstruction." "No," Nolan replied. "This is protection." Voss stepped back, smoothed his coat, and gave a slight nod. "Then we'll see each other again. Soon." That night, Valerie gathered her team. Nolan agreed to assist in the rescue. Gavin brought his truck, stocked with emergency gear. Jody would remain behind with Luna and the children. Ash sat at the back of the truck, gaze fixed on Wyatt, who clutched a scarf once belonging to Hazel. "You ready?" Valerie asked the boy. He nodded. "She's waiting." They drove for nearly 2 hours, winding through the Bitterroot Forest on unmarked roads. The GPS Micah had traced earlier pinged their destination, Hollow Pines Sanctuary, a former monastery built against the mountainside. They stopped short of the main gate, continuing on foot with lanterns and flashlights. Ash led the way, moving through the trees with silent certainty. They found a side entrance beneath the chapel, an old utility tunnel nearly hidden by brush. Valerie knelt and pried it open. The scent of old antiseptic and mildew rose from the darkness. Inside, the silence was unnatural. They moved quietly, passing empty rooms filled with prayer banners, broken instruments, and crates marked rehabilitation supplies. Down a hall padded with soundproof foam, they found the final door. Valerie turned the handle. Inside was a small room, lit by a single red lamp. A girl sat on a cot, knees drawn to her chest. Her hair was long, tangled, and her eyes were closed until Ash barked once. Her eyes opened. "Hazel." Wyatt dropped the lantern and rushed forward, arms flung around her. Hazel blinked in disbelief, then clutched him tightly, her lips forming his name. Valerie moved to her side, checking her pulse. Around Hazel's neck was a pendant engraved with the initials E, Mom Wyatt whispered. Hazel's voice was a ghost. They told me you were gone. They lied. Suddenly, Ash turned toward the hallway, growling. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. We have to move, Nolan barked. Gavin lifted Hazel onto his back, and they began the retreat. As they disappeared into the trees, Ash lingered, one last growl vibrating in his chest. The trees blurred past them in a dark rush of bark and shadow, as Valerie, Gavin, Nolan, Wyatt, Hazel, and Ash fled Hollow Pines. The moon hung low, dimmed by creeping clouds, casting only broken silver onto the forest floor. Every branch snapped underfoot, echoed like thunder in Valerie's ears. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Boots over rock shouted commands, the deep urgency of those unwilling to lose what they thought they owned. Ash led the charge, weaving through the trees with uncanny precision, his fur flashing like a ghost through the gloom. Hazel clung to Gavin's back, still weak but alert, whispering directions when the path grew unclear. Wyatt, breathless, kept pace with Ash, glancing back only when Nolan called out a warning. From behind them, the voice of Pastor Elias Voss rang out sharp and composed, despite the chaos. You're interfering with something divine, Sheriff Beck. Nolan didn't stop. Divine doesn't chain children to underground rooms, he growled, keeping one hand near the pistol holstered at his hip. Ash paused at a ridge, ears flicking nose in the wind. He turned sharply and veered left, just as two men in black emerged ahead, blocking the trail. Valerie spotted them first. Go wide, she hissed, motioning Gavin to break right. But it was too late. The men lunged. Ash was faster. The wolf sprang with a force that knocked one of them off his feet, fangs flashing. The other raised a baton, but Wyatt, without thinking, shouted. Ash turned in time, teeth sinking into the man's arm before he could strike. Valerie reached Hazel, pulling her into her arms and rushing past. Behind them, Nolan drew his sidearm and fired once into the air. Federal evidence on file, he shouted. You attack again, that's assault on law enforcement. That was enough. Voss and his men backed off, fading into the trees. Ash, panting, rejoined the group, his shoulder scratched, but not bleeding. Wyatt touched his fur, whispering, "Thank you." They reached Gavin's truck just before dawn, parked beneath a bridge 2 miles from the sanctuary's gate. The vehicle roared to life, and none of them looked back. A week later, the snow over Missoula had begun to melt. The city smelled of wet bark, soft dirt, and the promise of spring. But in the hallways of Gallatin Ridge, now officially renamed the Ellison Haven Transformation, had already bloomed. Federal investigators had acted swiftly. Nolan, with Valerie's documentation and Luna's eyewitness statement, handed over everything to a Justice Department contact. Within 48 hours, Order of the Dawnlight was under full investigation. By the 3rd day, Hollow Pines had been seized. Hidden rooms were unearthed. Medical logs, falsified identity forms, and video footage, all marked with Dawnlight's insignia, were turned over to the FBI. Pastor Voss was taken into custody without incident. Back at Ellison Haven, Valerie sat beside Hazel in the courtyard garden, now freshly cleaned and planted with winter-hardy herbs. Hazel's strength had returned more quickly than expected. Her hair had been trimmed to her shoulders, her skin no longer pale with fear. She wore a navy hoodie with the name of the new center embroidered over her heart. "Do you remember the pendant?" Valerie asked. Hazel nodded and clutched it. "Mom gave it to me before they took her away. She said it was from the program, Sierra Echo, that if anything ever happened, I had to protect Wyatt." Valerie smiled. "You did." Later that day, Gavin met Valerie in the converted west wing of the facility. The floors still smelled of varnish, the walls painted soft gray and white. This would be the new base for the Ashlight program, a canine therapy and rescue training initiative modeled loosely after Sierra Echo, but with full transparency and child protection at its core. Gavin, now in a flannel shirt and cargo jeans, held a clipboard. "First 2 applicants are local," he said. "One's a veteran with PTSD. The other's a teen from the foster system who hasn't spoken since age 9. Valerie looked at the open training yard through the window. Ash stood outside beside Wyatt and Hazel, who were painting a large canvas propped up on an easel. "That's who this is for," she said. "Not the system. Not the headlines. Them." In the Great Hall, an unveiling ceremony had been planned. Jody Lamar stood proudly beside the children, her usual cardigan replaced by a blue blazer with a brooch shaped like a wolf's paw. Sheriff Nolan Beck attended in uniform, though he'd removed his badge for the event. The mural was revealed just after sunset. It showed 2 children, Hazel and Wyatt, standing together at the edge of a golden field, the morning sun rising behind them. Between them stood Ash, head held high, fur glowing with light. Above, in careful handwriting, the title read, "Guardian of Light." Applause echoed across the hall. But Wyatt, eyes glistening, stepped forward quietly and placed a paw print stamp at the bottom of the mural. Ash's paw pressed gently into soft paint. The room went silent. Ash didn't move, but his tail wagged once. Later that evening, Valerie and Gavin walked the garden paths, while Ash trailed behind, now officially recognized not only as Wyatt's support animal, but as the first inducted member of the Ashlight program. "It could have gone differently," Gavin said. "But it didn't," Valerie replied, "because something kept believing there was still light worth finding." They looked back toward the center. Inside, Hazel and Wyatt curled together on a couch, with Luna between them, sharing a blanket and a mug of hot cider. For the first time, no one looked afraid. Sometimes the strongest light comes from those who've been through the deepest dark. This story reminds us that family is not always made by blood, but by loyalty, by courage, and by showing up when it matters most. In a world that often forgets the quiet ones, the hurting ones, it only takes one act of love to start the healing. Maybe like Ash, you've carried someone through their hardest moment. Or maybe you're still waiting for someone to carry you. Either way, you are not forgotten. You are not alone. If this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what family means to you. And if you believe healing is possible through love, through loyalty, through light, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories waiting to be told.